Hello, Read Aloud Adventure friends. Today we will be reading about a class full of tattletales. What's a tattletale, you ask? Well, it's someone who tattles on others constantly. They squeal on each other, no matter how small the problem is. Do you think you know what the difference between a tattle and an emergency is? Let's read the book to find out. Parents and teachers, don't forget to download the free printable activity worksheet for this book after listening to the story. Link down below. Now let's get started. Don't squeal unless it's a big deal. A Tale of Tattletales. Written by Jeanie, Franz, Ransom. Illustrated by Jackie Urbanovic. There were 19 students in Mrs. McNeal's class, and 19 tattletales. It all started when Jessica trotted up to Mrs. McNeal's desk. "Peter pulled my pigtail." "That must have hurt," Mrs. McNeal said. "Did you tell Peter that?" Jessica nodded. Mrs. McNeal said, "Let's see what Peter has to say." Peter dragged his hooves all the way up to Mrs. McNeal's desk. "Jessica says you pulled her pigtail," Mrs. McNeal said. "Hey! I did not," Peter said. "Yes, you did," Jessica said. "You both have the right to say how you feel," Mrs. McNeal said. "You also have the right to feel safe and comfortable at school. Rules like keep your hooves to yourself make it easier to do that." Mrs. McNeal added, "But since Jessica's tail is still attached, and Peter doesn't look particularly dangerous at the moment, I think it's safe to go back to your desks now." Jessica stomped. Peter snorted. Mrs. McNeal started humming "The Farmer in the Dell." Mrs. McNeal had just lifted her cup of slop for a quick slurp when Stephen trotted up. "Rachel took my pink marker and she won't give it back. I even asked her 2 times." Mrs. McNeal put down her cup. "Stephen, I'm so glad you tried to fix the problem yourself first by talking to Rachel," she said. "Maybe her ears aren't working too well today. Let's find out." "Stephen can't find his pink marker," Mrs. McNeal said. "Have you seen it?" "I gave it back," Rachel cried. "I can't find my pink marker." "That's because you used it all up," Peter said. "You're always drawing pictures of pigs." Rachel sniffed. "Hey! For your information, those pictures are of moi. What am I supposed to do? Color myself green?" "You know our class rule, Rachel," said Mrs. McNeal. "If you want to borrow something, ask first. It's how friends treat friends and stay friends." Mrs. McNeal had just taken her first sip of slop when Megan announced, "Frankie called Suki a fat so." Mrs. McNeal had to gulp her slop before she could speak. She cleared her throat and hoped she didn't have a corn kernel in her teeth. "I'm glad you know our class rules so well," Mrs. McNeal said. "You're right. We don't call each other names. Also, we don't try to fix problems that don't belong to us," Mrs. McNeal said. "I know you're trying to help, but if Frankie and Suki have a problem, it's their job to fix it. If they can't, it's my job as the teacher to help them. Your job," Mrs. McNeal added, "is to take care of you. That's the most important job you can have." Megan danced a jig all the way back to her desk. But then the stampede started. Robbie breathed on me. Jonathan ripped my paper. Emily called my desk a pigsty. Laura looked at me. Jeremy's grunting, and I can't concentrate. Sam is picking his snout.
Bruh.
The students had practically worn a path to Mrs. McNeal's desk and worn out her patience. When she stood up, the students sat down. Before we go to lunch, I think we need to add a new rule to our list, Mrs. McNeal said. A very important rule, she added. Can anyone tell me what squealing is? Students started squealing like their tails were stuck in a gate. Not that kind of squealing, Mrs. McNeal shouted, waving a cowbell. When the class was quiet, Mrs. McNeal continued. Squealing, she said, is my special word for tattling. And I know you know what that is. Some students looked at the floor. Some looked at each other. Some looked at the ceiling like they'd suddenly seen something interesting up there. Mrs. McNeal started writing on the board. Here's our new class rule, Mrs. McNeal said. Don't squeal unless it's a big deal. What does it mean? Jessica asked. I'm glad you asked, Mrs. McNeal said. To squeal on someone means you go tell a grown-up when someone does or says something you don't like, instead of telling that person first. Most problems that happen between kids are kid-sized problems. They can work out themselves, Mrs. McNeal said, usually by talking, listening, and helping each other. But sometimes, Mrs. McNeal said, something happens that's bigger than a kid-sized problem. Like when someone is hurt or in danger, or when a person is hurting you, or hurting a pet, or hurting something that doesn't belong to them or that belongs to all of us. That's when it's okay to squeal, because it's a big deal. When it's a big deal, it's an emergency. That's when you need to hoof it and get help from a grown-up. Oscar raised his hoof. I know it's not a big deal, Mrs. McNeal, but I'm hungry enough to eat a haystack. Mrs. McNeal laughed. Me too. I'm sure we'll get to practice what we've learned when we get back. But that afternoon, Mrs. McNeal had barely closed the classroom gate when Katie said, Jenny hogged the rope swing at recess. Mrs. McNeal pointed to the board. Remember what we just learned? Katie nodded. Then you know you need to tell Jenny first about the problem. Tell me what? Jenny yelled from across the room. That you were hogging the swing, Katie yelled back. You never asked for a turn, Jenny said. I didn't get a turn, Jeremy said. It's not my fault, Peter said. Not this time. It's Carolyn's fault, Suki said. Who's Carolyn? Oscar asked. She's not even in our class, Frankie said. Thump! Mrs. McNeal had disappeared. Are you okay? Megan asked. Mrs. McNeal didn't answer. Her eyes were closed. Her tail was limp. One ear had something red on it. "Quick! Call the office! Tell them it's an emergency! Somebody get a nurse! Somebody tell Mrs. Hamlin next door!" Later that afternoon, the students visited Mrs. McNeal in the nurse's office. "We're sorry we squealed so much today," Jessica said. "We didn't mean to make you mad," Peter said. "It's all our fault," Katie cried. "It wasn't anybody's fault," Mrs. McNeal said. "It was an accident. I slipped on some spilled slop. It must have been quite a mess." "We thought you had exploded," Jeremy said. "It was pretty gross," Oscar added. "Maybe you'd better not eat that stuff anymore," Rachel said. "You need to take care of yourself." "It sounds like all of you took care of the problem," Mrs. McNeal said. "Everyone says you knew just what to do when I got hurt." "Only because you're such a good teacher," Jessica said. "And you're such good learners," Mrs. McNeal said. "We still need some practice," Katie said. "We all do when we learn something new," Mrs. McNeal said. "So let's practice. Don't squeal unless it's a big deal." So in the end, Mrs. McNeal's class finally learned the difference between small kid-sized problems and big deal emergencies. Remember, friends, kid-sized problems can usually be solved by talking, listening, and helping each other. If you remember to do these 3 important things, then most problems can be solved without any adult help. But if it's a real emergency, like if someone is hurt or in danger, or if someone is hurting you or destroying something that isn't theirs, then it's important to tell an adult you trust and get some help. Now go and put what you have learned today into action. Remember, don't squeal unless it's a big deal. Go solve some problems and then come back soon for another Read Aloud Adventure.